So after the oocyte has been ovulated and it has entered the fallopian tube, now what's interesting about that is that the fallopian tube is not directly attached to the ovary. So the oocyte is released from the ovary and then generally will go into the fallopian tube, but it is possible that sometimes they might not make it into the fallopian tube and you would end up with an egg in the abdomen. If it actually has been fertilized, that's what would lead to an abdominal pregnancy. Anyway, so the oocyte is viable for about 12 to 24 hours after ovulation, and sperm are viable for about 12 to 48 hours after ejaculation. So the sperm have to be able to get up the vagina through the uterus into the fallopian tube, and fertilization generally happens in the fallopian tube. So as long as the oocyte is still viable and the sperm are viable when they get there, then fertilization is possible. So many sperm, and there's some really good pictures of this, where the sperm, hundreds of sperm might reach the oocyte at the same time. And the sperm undergo a reaction that helps to kind of digest away the outer layers, protective layers around the oocyte. The first sperm, though, that actually gets to the membrane of the oocyte, that sperm gets, there are receptors there that will pull the head of the first sperm in, and then there's a block that stops any other sperm from getting into the egg. The oocyte, then, remember, it hasn't finished its second meiotic division, so it divides so that just one copy of every chromosome is left, and fertilization really completes when the genetic material of the sperm combines with the genetic material of the oocyte to form the fertilized egg, which is called a zygote. So that fertilized egg is now in the fallopian tube. It starts to divide by mitosis multiple times and goes through different stages. For example, the morula stage, these cells are pretty much all the same. They've divided by mitosis. But as it becomes a blastocyst, now you see the cells start to differentiate a little bit, in that a cell on one side may not be exactly, genetically the DNA is the same, but the proteins that are being made in these cells are a little bit different, so that by the time you get to the late blastocyst and it's gotten into the uterus and maybe found a nice spot to implant in the uterus, now the cells have actually changed enough that you have this outer trophoblast layer and this inner ball of cells, which is eventually going to become the embryo or the fetus. So the center ball of cells, it now starts to become the main types of tissue that will form in the fetus. The outer cells of that blastocyst now are kind of digging their way into the uterus and providing nutrients by digesting the parts of the uterine wall to help provide the nutrients needed by the forming embryo. So the three early stages of embryonic development are called the ectoderm, which will eventually become the nervous system and the skin. The endoderm, which will eventually become the mucosa and various glands. And then in the center is the mesoderm, which will become muscles and some connective tissues. Those outer trophoblast cells, as they've dug into the uterine lining, start to work with the maternal cells to form the placenta. The placenta is important as a barrier between the mother and the embryo, so that blood and large cells are not exchanged. It also becomes a more efficient way of delivering nutrients and oxygen from the mother to the developing embryo, and allows for waste generated by the growth of the embryo and all the metabolic processes that are happening in there to be removed to the maternal blood. The placenta also becomes an endocrine organ. It will start producing hormones, the progesterone that, so corpus luteum of the follicle that was around the egg is producing progesterone for the first, 8 to 12 weeks of the pregnancy. Beyond that, the placenta takes over, making that progesterone and making the estrogen that will help maintain the pregnancy as well as other hormones. So by about the 8th week of development, all of the major organ systems are formed. We start to call it a fetus at the beginning of the 9th week when all those organs have been formed. And really, as the fetus grows, you have a tremendous amount of growth and organ specialization as the organs become more and more mature. There are a lot of developmental things that are happening during this development. The gender is, of course, determined at fertilization, where if there's an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, the fetus will be male. And if there are 2 X chromosomes, the fetus will be female. The gonads really form about the end of the 8th week, so they're some of the last organ systems to really start to develop. The testes actually form up in the abdominal cavity, and then they descend down into the scrotum like a month before birth. Really, the determining factor for the gonads forming is the presence of testosterone made in the male. The reproductive system organs are present but don't really function or mature until puberty, which can begin between the ages of 10 and 15. The first menses in females usually occurs about 2 years after the start of puberty, and most women reach their peak reproductive ability in their late 20s. So just a word about menopause. So menopause occurs by definition when ovulation and menses cease entirely. When you haven't menstruated for a year is one of the ones that I've seen. Ovaries stop functioning as endocrine organs, so they're not making the estrogen and progesterone that they had been prior to that. There isn't really a functional equivalent to menopause in males, but there is a steady and very significant decline in testosterone, so that the masculinizing effects of testosterone decrease.